Salvete omnes. This is a lesson on dependent subjunctive clauses, focusing on purpose clauses. We have adverbial final clauses, comparative final clauses, adjectival final clauses, and substantive final clauses. Firstly, what does a purpose clause look like in English? Because purpose clauses look towards the end, that is, the willed or wished outcome of an event, they are called final or telic, that is Greek telos, telus to, the end or the goal, so the end. So these are telic clauses because they look towards the willed outcome of some event. English does not always use a clause to express purpose. So each of the following English sentences contains an expression of purpose. Sentence number 1, I ran to see the fire. So notice how English here uses the infinitive here, to see the fire. Can you point out the purpose expressions in each sentence? Number 1, to see the fire. So we have infinitive, to see the fire. That is why I ran. To see the fire explains why I ran. Sentence 2, many men praise others so as to be praised themselves. Why do many men praise others? So as to be praised themselves. In sentence 3, he did this for the purpose of not displeasing you. Why did he do this? For the purpose of not displeasing you. So English will indicate purpose either by using an infinitive, the to verb, or English will use so as to, in order to, for the purpose of, and such like, to express purpose. Moving on to Latin, we know a few ways to express purpose in Latin that don't involve the subjunctive, and it might be useful to review them right now. So we know that the gerund or the gerundive with causa or gratia means for the sake of and expresses purpose. For example, Caesar ad oppidum metiendi frumenti causa contendit. Caesar hastened to the town. Why he do that? For the sake of doling out, for meting out the grain. You could replace causa with gratia for the sake of meting out, measuring out, doling out the grain. We could also use ad plus the accusative gerund or gerundive, which is a lot like the genitive, gerund, or gerundive. So, Caesar ad metiendum frumentum ibi moratus est. Caesar delayed ibi in that place. Why he do that? Ad metiendum frumentum, to dole out the grain, for the doling out of the grain, to measure out the grain. And finally, an accusative supine with verbs of motion. So if you have a verb of motion, like sending, they sent messengers. Well, they sent messengers to him. Why did they do that? To ask for aid. Rogatum auxilium. Remember that the accusative supine is the fourth principal part of the verb, ending only in The accusative supine ends only in The ablative supine ends in u, letter u. Accusative supine, So rogatum auxilium, ad eam miserunt. This only works with verbs of motion, like sending. They went to ask for aid, etc. All right, let's move on to the subjunctive, to the big part of the lesson. So there are 3-ish kinds of dependent subjunctive purpose clauses in Latin. Chapter 44 is going to deal with these 2-ish, actually 3. 1, 2, 3. And then chapter 45 deals with the substantive clauses at the bottom, the indirect commands. So adverbial. The adverbial purpose clause is introduced by ut for the positive, ne for the negative. For example, Caesar ad oppidum contendit. Caesar hastens to the town. Why does he do that? Why? For what purpose? Why, being an adverb, is going to be answered by an adverb. So, in this case, an adverb clause, an adverbial clause, an adverbial purpose clause. That's why it's called an adverbial clause. Why does Caesar hasten to the town? So that he may dole out the grain. Ut, so that, frumentum metiator. The rule for tenses here is that if you have a main verb that is present tense or future tense or present subjunctive or future perfect or an imperative, then the verb in the dependent subjunctive clause should be present. If this verb were past tense, imperfect, perfect, or pluperfect, then that makes the subjunctive verb in the dependent clause imperfect subjunctive. And we'll see a few examples like that at the bottom. Make sure you understand that and you keep that in mind. If the main verb is present, present subjunctive, future, future perfect, or imperative, that is called primary sequence, and the subjunctive verb will be present. If the main verb is imperfect, perfect, or pluperfect, that is the past tenses, the subjunctive verb must be in the imperfect tense. That's how it works for purpose clauses, so keep that in mind. So, if Caesar hastened, contendit ad oppidum, hastened to the town, then this would change from metiator, the present, to metiritor, the imperfect. All right, so an offshoot of the adverbial purpose clauses are the comparative purpose clauses, where if there's a comparative inside the clause, then instead of being introduced by ut, it's introduced by quo. That's basically it. Otherwise, it's the exact same thing. Gladios milites trinxerunt, quo facilios pugnarent. So the soldiers drew their swords. Why do they do that? So that they might fight more easily. They drew their swords to fight more easily. Why do they draw their swords? So that more easily, facilios, there's the comparative, more easily fight. So instead of ut, we have quo, because of the comparative. Now check out the verb tenses. Strinxerunt, that's the perfect tense, so we are in secondary sequence. Imperfect, perfect, or pluperfect, secondary sequence. That makes the subjunctive verb, the verb in the subjunctive dependent clause, imperfect. Imperfect. So if this were present tense, the soldiers are drawing their swords, then this would be in the present tense. It would be in primary sequence. But because this is perfect, it's in secondary sequence. All right, excellent. Optime. Besides the adverbial and comparative purpose clauses, we have an adjectival flavor of purpose clauses, just when you thought there wasn't enough. So adjectival, these are often called relative purpose clauses, because they're introduced by the relative pronoun instead of ut or ne. So qui, quae, quod. The reason why these are adjectival is because relative pronouns, well, they act like adjectives. They're pronouns in that they take the place of a noun, but they introduce adjectival clauses that give more information about nouns. So they're translated pretty much the same way as the adverbial kind, only it's a little bit different in Latin. English, there's not much difference in translation. It is a little bit different in Latin. So, Caesar tribunos misit, qui frumentum metirentur. So, Caesar sent tribunes. Why did he do that? Well, so that they might measure out, dole out the grain. So instead of ut, introducing an adverbial clause. This purpose clause right here is actually giving the purpose of the antecedent. The antecedent of the relative is tribunos. That's who we're talking about here. Caesar sent tribunes, and these tribunes are the guys who are to do this thing. Who were to do this thing. So this adjectival relative purpose clause basically is just giving us more information about the purpose of the antecedent. It's giving us the antecedent's job instead of telling us why the action happened. As I said, you're probably not going to translate the adverbial and the adjectival flavors very differently. They're pretty much translated the same in English. Very little difference. In Latin, just keep in mind that for the Romans, adjectival relative, it's giving the purpose of the antecedent, the purpose of the tribunes. Why did Caesar send these tribunes? What's their job? It's to dole out the grain. As opposed to, why did Caesar hasten to the town? Well, so that he could dole out the grain. And then finally, the usage of the purpose clause that will show up in chapter 45. It gets its own chapter because there are a lot of verbs that go with this one. And you want to take a little bit more time to not really memorize those verbs, but understand which verbs take indirect commands. So this is called the substantive kind of purpose clause. And substantive means noun. So we have an adverb kind of purpose clause, an adjective kind of purpose clause, and a noun kind of purpose clause. These are more commonly called indirect commands. That's how you're going to see them in the Jenny textbook. That's how you're going to see them in most other textbooks. They follow command request verbs. So you have a verb of commanding, requesting, asking, entreating, begging, etc. I'll show you in the next page. And then ut or ne. So for example, Caesar militibus imperat, ne castra prope silvam ponant. So Caesar commands the soldiers, remember impero takes the dative, commands the militibus, the soldiers. What does he command them? Or what does he command them not to do? What? What? That's going to be answered by a noun. What is that? Well, that is a thing. A thing is a noun. That thing. So this is a noun clause. That's why it's called a substantive. Substantive means noun. So these are noun clauses. It's what Caesar commands the soldiers. They're a lot like indirect statements, only instead of statements, these are commands. They take the subjunctive instead of an accusative infinitive construction. So they follow the sequence of tenses. So imperat, present tense, primary sequence, followed by the, check it out guys, ponant, the present subjunctive. It works. It's magic. Then if we had imperavit, change imperat the present to the perfect tense and kicked us into secondary sequence, then ponant, the present subjunctive, would turn into, wait for it. Good job. The imperfect subjunctive, ponerent. Ponerent. So, Caesar militibus imperat, ne castra prope silvam ponant. Caesar commands the soldiers not to pitch camp near the forest. Not to build the camp near the forest. Lest, he commands them lest they do this, so they not do this. Remember originally, these subjunctives were paratactical. If you remember the Latin moods video, you might want to review that. That if you had something like, Caesar hastens to the town, may he met out the grain. So there, instead of an ut, there'd be something like a pause or a break here. And these were considered to be sort of on the same level, paratactic. Caesar hastens to the town, pause. May he met out the grain. So these were more seen early on in old Latin as independent subjunctives. As time went on, they were more seen as subordinate, and so they were put underneath, subordinate, below, beneath the main clause, and linked to the main clause with this ut, or quo, or the relative. So then we have subordinate, subjunctive. That's what the subjunctive means. It's underjoined. It's joined under to a main clause. So what was once paratactic on the same level becomes hypotactic, subordinate. All right, let's check out some substantive indirect commands. If you're just now in chapter 44, you're done for now. You only need to know the adverbial, the comparative, and the adjectival purpose clauses, the relative purpose clauses. The adverbial, the comparative, and the relative. You can stop right now if you're in chapter 44. If you're in chapter 45, keep watching. So substantive purpose clauses, indirect commands. Here we go. These are purpose clauses. They follow verbs of commanding and ordering, notably not eubeo, eubere, usi, usus. That takes a subject accusative and objective infinitive construction. So if I order you to do your homework, I order you, subject accusative you, to do the objective infinitive to do your homework. So eubeo does not take an indirect command, does not take a subjunctive. It takes a subject accusative, objective infinitive. Remember that. That's very notable. Caesar will often use eubeo and impero and mando and etc. because he gives a lot of commands. He often uses them in the same chapter, in the same paragraph, often one sentence right after the other, somewhat interchangeably. And he always uses eubeo with the subject accusative, objective infinitive. Impero takes the dative, and ut or ne plus an indirect command. Mando takes a dative, ut or ne plus an indirect command, etc. At least Caesar's consistent, even though he uses them kind of all over the place. So impero, imperare, imperavi, imperatus, and mando, mandare, mandavi, mandatus both mean to command or order, to give a command, and they both take the dative. And they're both followed by ut or ne, and plus the subjunctive, to show what, substantive, noun, what is being commanded. Verbs of asking and entreating, like rogo, rogare, rogave, rogatus, quaero, quaerere, quaesivi, quaesitus, plus a of and the ablative, to ask question of an ablative. Peto, petere, petivi, petitus, plus a of and the ablative, to ask or beg of an ablative. Postulo, postulare, postulavi, postulatus, plus a of and the ablative, to demand or ask or require of an ablative. Imploro, implorare, imploravi, imploratus, to beg, beseech, appeal to implore. And oro, orare, oravi, oratus, to beg or beseech. Verbs of persuading and urging will take indirect commands, a substantive clause of purpose, like definitely persuadeo. Persuadeo is a big one. Persuadeo, persuadere, persuasi, persuasus. Takes the dative, means to persuade. Horto, hortari, hortatus sum, to encourage, exhort, to urge. That takes ut or ne plus the subjunctive, to urge someone so that they do something, to urge someone to do something. And then moneo, monere, monui, monitus, to warn, to advise, to urge, can take an indirect command. Verbs of allowing or entrusting, like permitto, permittere, permissi, permissus, which takes the dative, to entrust something to a dative. Notably, patior pati passus sum, which means to endure, to allow, to suffer, to allow. And sino, sinere, si, visitus, those both will take a subject accusative and an objective infinitive, like eubeo. They will not take an ut or a ne subjunctive indirect command. They will not take a substantive clause of purpose. Optime. So, as a quick recap, purpose clauses using dependent subjunctives. These are dependent subjunctive clauses. The adverbial answers the question why, which is why it's an adverb clause, introduced by ut or ne. Caesar ad oppidum contendit ut frumentum metiator. Caesar hastens to the town so that he may dole out the grain. Why did he hasten to the town? To dole out the grain. If there is a comparative in the clause, it will not be introduced by ut, but instead by quo. Gladios milites trinxerunt, quo facilius pugnarent. The soldiers drew their swords so that they may fight more easily. There's the adjectival kind of purpose clause, more commonly called the relative purpose clause, introduced by the relative pronoun qui, quae, quod. It will agree with an antecedent in gender and number, not necessarily in case. Caesar tribunos misit, Caesar sent the tribunes. Yeah, who were they and what was their job? Well, they're to dole out the grain. Who might dole out the grain, who were to dole out the grain. This is their purpose. This is their job, to dole out the grain. And that's all you need to know if you are in chapter 44. If you are in chapter 45, you need to not only know those three-ish, but also add the substantive indirect commands. Command or request verb plus ut or ne. Caesar militibus imperat, ne castra prope silvam ponant. Caesar commands the soldiers, lest they pitch camp near the forest. Caesar commands the soldiers so that they not pitch camp near the forest. Optime. And one last review thing. Primary sequence means that if the main verb is present, present subjunctive, future, future perfect, or an imperative, primary sequence, that means that the dependent subjunctive verb must be in the present tense. If the main verb introducing the clause, the dependent subjunctive clause, is a past tense, imperfect, perfect, or pluperfect, you are in secondary sequence and the dependent subjunctive verb must be imperfect subjunctive. Optime. Very well done. You are now ready to move on to the exercises, starting with exercise A. Volete omnes.